It started with a letter, not a text, not an email, not even one of those annoying HOA group chat messages where everyone argues about mailbox colors. No, this was a real paper envelope, thick, cream-colored, with my name printed in bold block. Letters on the front like it was being delivered to a defendant in a courtroom drama. No return address, of course. Just that ominous feeling, like when you hear your name announced over a school PA system in the middle of class. Inside was a typed letter with a logo I recognized too well. The Oak Ridge Neighborhood Beautification Committee. Just reading the name made my eye twitch. This wasn't the first time I'd heard from them. Last spring, they sent me a pamphlet titled Aesthetic Harmony and You, which was really just a passive-aggressive guide about how to mow your lawn diagonally and plant beige chrysanthemums. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Taylor, it has come to our attention that your front yard contains an excessive number of decorative lawn figurines that may be considered in violation of community aesthetic standards." It went on to list the exact guideline, something buried in Article 7, Section C, Clause 3. Apparently, decorative items were to be limited in number and scope to ensure neighborhood cohesion and visual tranquility. I reread that last phrase, visual tranquility, twice, then laughed out loud. I glanced out the window, coffee mug still in hand. There they were, just beyond the glass, my beloved garden gnomes. 11 of them, arranged like old friends gathering for a reunion. Gary was holding his fishing pole near the bird bath. Linda was pushing her wheelbarrow full of fake flowers, and Buckley, my favorite, was mid-lawn mow, his tiny green mower tilted just slightly. They weren't disturbing anything. They weren't noisy. They weren't flashing neon lights. They were just cheerful. They brought personality to an otherwise bland row of identical beige homes with identical trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes. Excessive? Maybe. But I didn't think that warranted a threat, because that's exactly what followed. The letter ended with a formal request. Please remove the aforementioned items within 7 days to avoid accruing a daily fine of $50, as outlined in the Oak Ridge Residential Compliance Guidelines. A fine. $50 a day. That was $350 a week, more than my grocery bill. I stood there, letter in one hand, coffee in the other, rereading the sentence just to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. My first thought was that it had to be Marcia. She lived 2 doors down and had made no secret of her feelings about my lawn situation. She'd once stopped mid-jog to tell me, without so much as a hello, that my gnomes looked cluttered. I think she meant it as a dig, but I took it as a sign they were doing their job. Still, a fine was serious. I considered taking them in, just to avoid the hassle. But as I stood out on the porch later that evening, looking over the little crew, in their tiny ceramic poses, something inside me hardened. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the fact that Buckley looked especially determined under the fading orange light. No, I wasn't going to cave. Instead of removing the gnomes, I bought more. The next morning, I drove to every garden center I could find within a 30-mile radius. I bought swinging gnomes, fishing gnomes, sleeping gnomes, and even a gnome riding a pig. I found a funky little shop downtown where an artist sold hand-painted hipster-style gnomes. One of them wore skinny jeans and held a cold brew. Coffee. I bought that one too. When I got home, I carefully set them up around the yard. Not randomly, but with intention. I built little scenes. One group of gnomes was planting plastic vegetables in a small patch of dirt. Another was building a birdhouse. The hipster gnome? He leaned coolly against the mailbox, sipping his cold brew, looking like he owned the place. And then there was DJ Gnome, a new addition, complete with tiny sunglasses and a turntable. I set him on a painted wooden crate next to a plastic disco ball that caught the morning light just right. By the end of the week, my yard was a cheerful riot of color, activity, and tiny ceramic joy. Kids walking by with their parents would stop and point. One little girl shouted, "Mum, they have a gnome party!" A couple even took pictures. I waved from the porch, coffee in hand, like a proud curator of a living, breathing museum. Of course, the HOA wasn't as thrilled. 2 days later, they showed up in person. 3 of them, clipboards in hand, wearing beige vests like they were on a safari for violations. They walked around the perimeter of my yard, whispering and scribbling notes. I watched them from my window, trying not to laugh as one of them tripped over a small solar-powered mushroom light. They left without knocking, but another letter arrived the next day. This one was even more forceful. "Your continued noncompliance has resulted in the initiation of daily fines, effective immediately." They attached a spreadsheet showing a growing balance. The number at the bottom glared up at me like a parking ticket on steroids, but the letters didn't bother me anymore. Not really. What started as a silly personal protest was beginning to turn into something else. The gnomes weren't just decorations now. They were becoming a symbol, a stand, a declaration that personality had a place even in a community where rules reigned supreme. That night, as I adjusted DJ Gnome's glasses and straightened Sprout's tiny wheelbarrow, I realized I wasn't backing down. I was just getting started. The next week, my front yard transformed into something completely new, something bigger, brighter, and definitely more outrageous than before. Gnome after gnome began to populate the lawn like a tiny ceramic uprising. I wasn't just doubling down. I was declaring war. If the HOA wanted a problem, I'd give them one so colorful, so whimsical, they'd need therapy after driving past my house. It started with the swing set. Not a real one, of course, but a miniature version. I found it online. 2 gnomes swinging under a tiny arbor made of plastic vines. I placed it under the maple tree out front where the dappled sunlight hit just right. Then I added a gnome campsite with a pretend fire and little logs for them to sit on. One of them held a marshmallow on a stick. It was ridiculous, but it made me smile every time I looked at it. DJ Gnome, my breakout star, got his own tiny stage. I glued a Bluetooth speaker inside a plastic stump behind him and played quiet instrumental music during the day. Smooth jazz mostly, and some classical covers of pop songs. People walking by slowed down, kids danced. Some adults did too, after checking to make sure no one was watching. But I saw them from behind the curtains. Then came the tourists. Well, not actual tourists, but neighbors from other blocks who I'd never spoken to before began parking near my house just to look. At first they were shy, quick photos snapped from the sidewalk. But then someone knocked on my door and asked if I minded if their kids posed with the gnomes for a school art project. I told them to go ahead. That night, I got an idea. I created an Instagram account. Gnome. Sweet. Gnome. My very first post was a simple snapshot of Gary and Linda standing in front of the bird bath with a filter that made the morning light glow golden. I added a caption. Day 1. The resistance begins. Within 48 hours, I had over 500 followers. People loved it. I started posting daily updates, introducing each gnome with a name and a backstory. Meet Sprout, passionate about sustainable gardening and sunflower seeds. Hasn't mowed his lawn since 2003. Or, this is Buckley. He's in charge of Neighborhood Watch. Hasn't actually watched anything but squirrels. I didn't think much of it. Just a silly way to pass the time. Then the account went viral. Not millions of followers viral, but viral enough that my posts started getting shared. Gnome fan pages began tagging me. People from other states commented things like, "You're living the dream," and HOAs fear this man. Someone made a fan edit of DJ Gnome spinning at Coachella. I couldn't stop laughing. Naturally, the HOA was not amused. The next Saturday, 3 committee members came by again. This time, they brought a tape measure. They measured the height of the swing set, the distance between the gnomes, the size of the disco ball. One of them even crouched to measure a plastic mushroom light and muttered something like, "Outrageous." I sat on the porch sipping my coffee, wearing a shirt that said, "Make Gnomes Great Again." They didn't say anything to me, not directly. But a new letter arrived that afternoon. It was 4 pages long and printed in all caps for half of it. Apparently, my excessive lawn decor now violated 6 subsections of the community guidelines. There was a new clause about ambient audio disturbances and another about figurative art installations of disproportionate scale. Disproportionate? The tallest gnome was 12 inches, but then things got worse. One morning, I walked out to find that someone had messed with my setup. DJ Gnome had been moved behind a bush, and Linda's wheelbarrow was filled with gravel. Sprout was tipped over completely. It wasn't a random accident. Someone had done it on purpose. A quiet, spiteful kind of vandalism. I was furious. Not because of the gnomes, they could be cleaned up, but because someone was trying to silence what had become a joyful, silly, totally harmless rebellion. I fixed the scene, carefully, lovingly. Then I took a picture of the damage and posted it on Instagram with the caption, "They tried to silence us, but we just got louder." The comments exploded with support. People from other neighborhoods shared their own HOA horror stories. Someone tagged a local artist named Tasha, who was known for creating community street art installations. She messaged me the same night. "Your gnomes are awesome," she wrote. "Ever thought about turning the whole yard into a living installation? I'll help." We met the next day. Tasha was about 6 feet tall with neon green hair and tattoos of mushrooms winding down her forearms. She showed up with sketch pads full of ideas, painted pathways through the yard, miniature signs with gnome quotes, tiny murals on garden stones. Within a week, we'd created what looked like a storybook village. She even helped me build a small archway made of branches at the walkway with a hand-painted sign, "Welcome to Gnomelandia." Now, people really started to show up. Kids, teenagers, even bored-looking parents who soon found themselves grinning. I started hosting gnome walks on Saturday mornings. Nothing formal, just an hour where people could stroll through, take pictures, and hear the ridiculous backstories I made. Up on the fly. One gnome was apparently in witness protection. Another was running for mayor of the yard. The kids loved it. A high school student asked if she could do her senior photo shoot in the yard. I said yes. She wore a red pointed hat and posed with Gary like they were old friends. The HOA, meanwhile, was scrambling. Their letters became more frantic. Unauthorized community events, visual chaos, disruption of neighborhood integrity. But the problem for them now was simple. I had the people on my side. They couldn't find me without looking, like joy-killing overlords. And then the big break happened. A local news station called me. They'd heard about the man with the rebellious gnomes and wanted to do a short segment. I laughed, said sure, and invited them over. The next day, a reporter and camera crew came to film the gnome village. I wore a "Gnome Body Can Stop Us" hoodie and introduced each character like they were real people. The story aired that night. Oak Ridge man turns lawn dispute into unexpected art movement. The response was wild. Strangers sent me messages. A woman from Oregon wanted to donate custom gnomes. A small local bakery offered to sponsor the gnome walks with free cookies. By the end of the week, I received a call from the city's tourism office. They'd seen the news segment and wanted to talk about a partnership for something they called Gnome Fest. I nearly dropped my phone. In the beginning, I just wanted to keep my gnomes. I didn't want to start a movement or become the face of suburban lawn resistance. But somehow, that's exactly what happened. All because I refused to back down and because a group of tiny bearded statues made people smile in a world that didn't always give them a reason to. And somewhere, I'm sure Marsha was watching this all unfold, clutching her HOA handbook with a trembling hand. By the 3rd month, my yard had turned into something of a neighborhood pilgrimage site. What had started as a quiet protest, just me refusing to remove a few gnomes, had evolved into a full-blown attraction. On Saturday mornings, Families with strollers and kids in red pointed hats wandered down my driveway like it was an enchanted trail. I even saw people drive from other parts of town, parking their minivans down the block and unloading wide-eyed toddlers who shouted things like, "I found the marshmallow gnome!" It was surreal. I'd gotten used to people slowing down as they drove past, but now they actually stopped. Some asked if they could walk through the yard. Others handed me thank you cards. One guy gave me a $5 bill and said, "For the joy, man." I didn't know what to do with that, so I put the money in a tip jar by DJ Gnome's stage. It filled up faster than I expected. I started using it to buy supplies, solar lights, paint, little props to keep the scenes fresh. But the most unexpected part? My neighbors, the very same people who used to cross the street when they saw me coming, began to warm up. Not all of them, of course. Marcia still looked like she was chewing lemons every time she glanced in my direction. But others, like Tom, who used to glare at me every time I missed trash day, now came over with his son and helped plant daffodils around the Gnome fishing pond. Sarah, who once told me my mailbox clashed with the community's palate, brought over homemade brownies. No raisins, just good old chocolate and truce. One morning, I stepped outside and saw a folding table had been set up by the curb. It wasn't mine. At first I thought someone was trying to sell something, maybe lemonade. But then I saw Ethan, the teenage son of the family next door, standing behind the table with a red apron and a sign that read, "Gnome Walk Goodies, Cocoa, Cookies, and Carrot Cake." I laughed. He grinned and said, "Figured I might as well cash in on the foot traffic." He wasn't wrong. That Saturday, over 50 people came by. Some brought their own gnomes to introduce to the crew. Others donated decorations, tiny hats, wooden signs, fake mushrooms. One guy even offered me a custom-built waterfall feature with LED lighting for the gnome spa area I was building behind the hedge. The HOA, meanwhile, was imploding. Marcia showed up one Saturday afternoon during peak gnome walk hours, storming, across the lawn like a weather system in a blouse. She had her clipboard, of course, the sacred artifact of every HOA enforcer. I was in the middle of explaining to a group of kids how Sprout was a freelance soil therapist when I saw her coming. "You need to shut this down," she said, loud enough that a few heads turned. I smiled politely. "Marcia, lovely to see you. Would you like a cocoa?" She didn't laugh. "This is a violation of Articles 5, 7, and possibly 12, depending on how you define public assembly." "I define it as neighbors having fun," I said, then leaned down to fix Gary's tiny fishing rod. "This isn't a theme park. It's a residential community," she snapped. I stood up and gestured around. "Funny, because it sure feels like a community now." Several parents nearby nodded. Someone muttered, "Amen." A little girl in a gnome costume hugged my leg and whispered, "I love your yard." I looked Marcia straight in the eye and said, "You're welcome to walk through, by the way. No charge." She left in a huff, of course, scribbling furiously into her notes. I half expected a drone strike by the next morning. Instead, I got an email. It was from the local paper. One of their reporters had seen the Instagram account and wanted to do a feature. I agreed, though I warned them it was just a guy with too many lawn ornaments. The reporter came out on a Tuesday with a photographer and spent an hour walking through the yard, asking me about gnome placement strategy, artistic intention, and what my neighbors thought. I answered honestly. It started as a fight, now it's a family. The article came out the following weekend. The headline read, "Gnomebody does it better. One man's lawn becomes a local treasure." There was a picture of me standing between Linda and DJ Gnome, holding Buckley in my arms like he was a beloved house pet. The response was instant, local. Businesses reached out. A garden shop offered to sponsor some of the display. A bakery wanted to collaborate on gnome-shaped cookies. One artist offered to build a permanent gnome diorama with rotating seasonal themes: autumn harvest, winter wonderland, spring planting. Even better, the town's art council emailed me to say they were considering recognizing my yard as an official public art installation. I didn't even know that was a thing, but apparently it came with benefits, small grants, city maintenance assistance, and most importantly, the kind of status that could protect me from further HOA meddling. Then the tourism office called. They were planning a summer event series and had seen the article. "We think your gnome display could be a highlight," the woman said over the phone. "Would you be open to hosting a Gnome Fest weekend?" I blinked. "Like, with vendors and banners and costumes?" "Exactly," she said, excited. "We'd market it across the county, maybe even statewide. We'd pay you for the display and cover all logistical costs." I didn't know what to say. I was just a guy who bought too many lawn figurines and refused to throw them away. Now I was being asked to host a festival. I agreed. Of course I did. That night, I sat on the porch under a string of fairy lights, watching the wind ruffle Linda's ceramic apron. The gnomes stood quietly in the moonlight, frozen in their cheerful poses. DJ Gnome's sunglasses caught a glint of silver. I sipped hot cocoa, courtesy of Ethan's stand, and tried to wrap my head around what had just happened. I wasn't the villain anymore. I wasn't the rebel, the nuisance, the problem neighbor with a cluttered yard. Now, I was the gnome guy, the one who made people smile, the one who, intentionally or not, brought a little magic back to a neighborhood that had been choking on rules. The HOA still sent letters. Of course they did. But their words rang hollow now, outshouted by the laughter of kids, the music from DJ Gnome's speaker, and the steady chorus of strangers who stopped by to say, "This is amazing. It turns out, when you plant gnomes, you grow a community." Gnome Fest was the kind of beautiful chaos you couldn't plan for, only ride like a wave and hope you didn't fall face first into a tray of themed cupcakes. The city had put up signs around town. Gnome Fest this weekend, Magic Lives on Maple Lane. I stood at the edge of my front yard that Saturday morning, wearing a custom-made shirt with DJ Gnome printed across the chest, his tiny hands raised triumphantly above his decks. My installation, was roped off with winding garden paths lined by solar lanterns. Pop-up booths dotted the sidewalk. One sold gnome-themed cookies, another offered hand-painted figurines. A chalkboard sign at the corner read, "Gnome Your Neighbor," where people could write friendly notes to strangers and pin them to a clothesline. Stretched between two plastic toadstools, there were gnome hats everywhere. Children wore them, teens wore them ironically, and even some adults embraced the full red cone and beard look. Someone brought a live band that played acoustic folk covers under the old maple tree. DJ Gnome, of course, held his ground at his usual spot, now upgraded with LED lights synced to the rhythm. He didn't actually spin music. He was still a plastic statue, but someone had synced the outdoor speaker to make it seem like he was performing. The illusion was perfect. By noon, the street was packed. I had to set up directional signs to keep people moving in a smooth loop around the yard. There were gnome photo booths, a Name That Gnome contest, and even a guided tour every hour where I told the increasingly ridiculous backstories of each member of the Gnomelandia cast. Kids hung on every word. Parents smiled, shook their heads, and said things like, "This is nuts, but it's the good kind of nuts." I kept waiting for something to go wrong, for the HOA to swoop in with cease and desist letters or a stern warning from some county official. But nothing came. In fact, just before the afternoon rush, a man in a navy blazer stepped onto the lawn and introduced himself as a city council member. I froze, thinking this was it. Instead, he handed me a certificate, official recognition of community art installation, it read, awarded to Mr. Thomas Granger for creative excellence and community engagement. That was my name, Thomas Granger. I'd almost forgotten it in all the madness. For months, I'd just been the gnome guy. I stared at the certificate, blinking. "You've brought people together," the councilman said. "You've made art that makes people smile. That matters, more than some people realize." I thanked him, though the words didn't come easily. My throat was tight. By the time the sun began to dip behind the rooftops, fairy lights blinked on all around the yard. Soft music played from the speakers, and people lingered, reluctant to leave. Some sat on the grass with cookies in hand. Others took selfies with Linda near the bird bath, or posed beside Sprout, who now had a tiny award ribbon tied to his spade. Tasha, the artist who'd helped bring my wild ideas to life, showed up with 2 massive paintings, one of DJ Gnome crowd surfing a wave of other gnomes, the other of Marcia clutching a rulebook, while gnomes danced around her ankles. We laughed until tears ran down our faces. I offered to buy both. She insisted on giving them to me as a gift. It was nearly 9 when the crowd finally began to thin out. I was exhausted in the best way possible, like I'd just hosted a wedding in a circus at the same time. My legs ached, my cheeks hurt from smiling. But I wasn't alone. A group of volunteers helped clean up. Teenagers collected litter, adults took down booths, and the remaining gnomes that had been temporarily borrowed for games were returned to their rightful places. I stood by the archway with a lantern in hand, saying goodbye to the final wave of guests. Then Marcia appeared. She stood just beyond the string of lights, looking tired, like she'd spent the day fighting a very private war and losing at every turn. She wasn't holding her clipboard. That surprised me. I didn't say anything. I waited. After a long pause, she crossed the lawn, heels clicking softly against the flagstones I'd laid down for the festival. She stopped a few feet in front of me, arms crossed. Her lips were tight, like she was choosing each word from a carefully labeled drawer. "You really pulled it off," she said. "I did," I replied quietly. "I didn't mean to, but yeah." She looked around at the remaining decorations, the lanterns swaying gently in the breeze, the fading laughter of people walking to their cars. She sighed. This whole thing was completely against code. I know. She tilted her head. But it worked. I haven't seen this neighborhood act like a community in years. I blinked, caught off guard. "Is that a compliment?" She smirked. "A tiny one, but it was there. Don't push your luck." We stood in silence for a moment longer. Then she reached into her coat pocket and handed me a small envelope. "Consider it a peace offering," she said, "and don't make me regret it." I opened the envelope after she left. Inside was a printed form, already signed, authorizing a permanent decorative installation for purposes of public enjoyment. It was HOA approval. Official, stamped and everything. On the back, someone had scribbled, "Just don't let it become a gnome amusement park." I laughed loudly. The next morning, I sat on my porch with coffee in hand. The gnomes were still in place, but now they looked different to me. Not just lawn ornaments or symbols of defiance, but markers of something better. I didn't set out to win a fight. I set out to keep something that brought me joy. In the process, I discovered that joy, when shared, is a kind of quiet revolution. People still came by in small groups. The tip jar stayed out, and donations trickled in. Local artists asked to contribute. The city offered to help maintain the grounds. And one morning, a letter arrived from a woman in Vermont who said she'd started her own Gnome Garden of Rebellion, inspired by my story. Enclosed was a photo of her first gnome, sitting proudly on a tiny Adirondack chair. So now they pay me to display them, my gnomes. Not just with money, but with laughter, attention, community, and the kind of warmth you can't put a price on. I never asked for that, but I'll take it, because sometimes when they try to bury you in rules, the best response is to plant something and let it grow.